Welcome to part 3 in our 5-part series on not-for-profit financial statements. I'm Jackie McLaughlin with Chazin and Company. As outsourced accounting professionals, we can help. Part 3 is all about how to budget. Now, most people don't exactly like budgeting. It's not something they look forward to. So I like to help them get in a better headspace before they sit down to start that budgeting process. And to get in a better headspace, it's important to reframe your perspective about budgeting. Instead of it being something that you dread, look at it this way. Budgets really aren't restrictive. The time that you put in upfront to budget will save you all kinds of time during the upcoming fiscal year. You've already thought through what you're going to do in the upcoming year, and you've allocated dollars to it. So it will help you just execute the year instead of constantly making decisions about what you're going to do. Budgets will keep you on course. It's very, very easy for you to come up with a number of wonderful ideas that you want to implement once you're into that year. But if you haven't budgeted for them, you probably shouldn't implement them. So that budget is going to keep you on course to achieve the piece of the strategic plan that you concluded you want to achieve in the upcoming year. Because budgets do represent that progress towards the strategic plan. Now, as I like to talk about quite a bit, they also help with decision fatigue. If you're like most executive directors, you probably have staff coming at you multiple times a week with 100 great ideas. But if you've put time and energy into budgeting properly, you don't have to think about that. You just ask your staff, is it in the budget? If it's not, the answer is no, and try budgeting for it next year. And budgets keep you focused on doing what you said you wanted to do. It's important to prepare a new budget every single year. Why? Because your organization is going to change every single year. If nothing else, next year you'll be executing a different part of the strategic plan than you executed this year. A good organization is constantly making changes within it to help donors and grantors and ultimately to help further their mission. The budget should represent those changes, and therefore it should be done every single year. If you have budget managers, and you might call them department heads, you might call them vice presidents, you might call them by a variety of different titles, but for this purpose, we're going to call them budget managers. It's important to involve your budget managers so that you can hold them accountable for their budget all throughout the year. It's difficult to hold them accountable when they haven't had a say-so in what their budget is. More importantly, your budget managers are going to know their areas of responsibility far better than anyone else on the team. It will also give them a voice in the inevitable cuts that will be required to balance the budget. They, again, more than anybody else, should know where they can cut without sacrificing quality or service. It's difficult to sit down with a blank piece of paper and start a budget. So we recommend starting with actual historical data. Don't start with last year's budget or the current year's budget because you're probably not performing consistent with that budget. So that budget isn't necessarily good data to start with. The best data to start with is to take the last 12 months of actual data that your organization has, and that becomes your starting place to budget for the upcoming fiscal year. The easy change that you can make to that is to increase your expenses by the approximate rate of inflation. When you begin budgeting those expenses, you'll have a couple kinds of costs, fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs really can't be changed in the short term. They're costs like your lease, the rental on your lease. You have a contract and it specifies every single year how much you're going to have to pay your landlord. Doesn't really change. You need utilities. Now, granted, The amount you pay for utilities may change from month to month to month, but your past 12 months data should give you a pretty good idea of how much your utilities cost. Salaries are another one. You know the existing staff you have right now and how much they make. So factor in those salaries with any kind of salary increases or bonuses. Then there's a type of cost called variable costs, and these can vary, which is why they're called variable costs. So for example, if in the current year you put out a catalog or some kind of hard copy document, that might not be something you're going to do again next year. So that would be a variable cost you don't have to budget for. Maybe you held an event this year and you've decided not to do that same event next year. The cost you spent this year for that event wouldn't have to be budgeted for. But again, neither would the revenue in that example. You'll want to update your budget for any planned changes. So maybe those changes are you're going to hire more people. If so, hopefully you have an approximate amount that you're going to pay them. And then we always recommend adding 30% onto that to account for things like vacation, holidays, health insurance, a variety of different benefits that they get. Usually add on about a 30% upcharge to what you're planning on their salary being. The other changes that you might have, we talked about on the last slide. Maybe you're going to do something you've never done before, a new event, a new conference, maybe a new publication. You'll want to make sure that you approximate the cost of those and budget for that too. Maybe you're going to stop doing things you've done in the past. Maybe you're going to stop doing an event or a conference or a publication. Make sure that you take out those costs and the associated revenue. Timings and deadlines are critical when you're budgeting. The board should be approving your new upcoming year's budget before that upcoming year starts. So if you have a calendar year end, the board might have a meeting scheduled December 5th to approve the upcoming year's budget. You'll want to back that up at least 3 months and start September 5th or even earlier. On the slide, we use May 5th meeting date that the board might be meeting on May 5th for a June 30 year end to approve a budget to begin the upcoming July. If that's the situation your organization is in, you would want to begin that budgeting process February 5th or even earlier. These are deadlines that should be given to your budget managers, and they should be held to those deadlines. One of the tips and tricks we recommend is that typically when it comes to budgeting, people aren't going to hold to those budget deadlines. So if you kick the budgeting process off February 5th, consistent with the slide, you might want your data back February 28th from the budget managers. It's better to tell them you want it back February 20th so that you have 8 days to hound them to get it back to you. The budget that the budget managers come up with should be given to somebody in your finance or accounting department. That person will take all the different budgets and collate it into one overall budget. Oftentimes your organization's accounting software allows for this. When it's collated into an overall budget, you should take a look at the whole organization's budget and see if you're ending in a surplus, a deficit, or break even. Usually after this first draft of budgets, the budget ends in a deficit, and you don't want to do that, which means you're going to have to determine what kind of cuts need to be made in which departments, and you'll have to send those budgets back to the budget managers to start making cuts. One of the myths that are out there is because you're a nonprofit, the myth is you can't make a profit, and that's not true at all. If you don't make a profit, you're going to find it difficult to sustain yourself over the long haul. So when you budget a surplus, it will help build reserves if you come in at that surplus. When you budget a surplus, and if you miss that target, hopefully you'll come in at least break even. But if you budget a deficit, you're likely to come in at a bigger deficit than what you budgeted. So the next steps are that a budget with a surplus or break-even results should be reviewed and approved by the executive director, who may make more changes. That person needs to be very, very familiar with what's in the budget. Now, this will probably occur after maybe 4 or 5 drafts of the budget, because in reality, the budget will be kicked back to the budget manager to make cuts, and they will, and it will come back to the finance person who will make the changes and find that the organization is still running at a deficit. So they'll have to kick the budgets back to the budget managers again and ask for more cuts to be made. Sometimes it can take as many as 4 or 5 times. But once that budget's nailed down, then the executive director needs to be very, very comfortable with that and sign off on it so that it can be presented to the finance committee. The finance committee is a subsection of the whole board, and these are the people who will do a deep dive into the budget and question anything that doesn't make sense or that might not be consistent with the strategic plan. And this is why the executive director needs to be very comfortable with it, because chances are he or she will be the person answering the questions of the finance committee. Ultimately, that committee needs to approve it, and then it will go to the full board for approval. Note that the full board usually relies on the finance committee to vet a budget, so typically the full board will just sign off on it once the finance committee does. The full board, as I mentioned, will then approve the budget after the finance committee has approved it. The most important part is that once the budget's been approved, it's great to put it in your accounting software so that every single month the software can produce a report that shows actual results compared to the budget. This can be known as a budget variance report or budget versus actual report. Again, this should be produced monthly and provided to the budget managers as well as the executive director. Any large variances should be questioned, investigated, and explained. The board should be presented with a summarized version of the budget variance report at its board meetings. Usually, a board will ask questions about any large variances, and certainly the finance committee will as well. So when you have large variances, it's always good to determine how you're going to course correct. Finance committees and boards tend to get less flustered by large negative variances in budgets as long as the organization has a plan to course correct. So this concludes part 3 of our 5-part series. In part 4, we'll talk about the statement of activities, which you might know of as the income statement or P&L. Until the next video.